Shadowy scenes of war in the South Atlantic. These Argentine satellite pictures show the British Harriers' bombardment of Argentine positions on the islands that Britain calls the Falklands and Argentina calls the Malvinas. With the dispute already a month old, this film was the first to show Britain's task force in action against the Argentines. An Argentine commander visits his troops in Port Stanley to boost their morale and tell them of their country's continued unwavering support. The Argentines were keen to show Port Stanley Airport, which had been repeatedly strafed by Britain's Royal Air Force. They insisted the airport was still operable, though damage had been inflicted on several small aircraft, including the British Governor's. Argentina also claimed a success at the Goose Green airstrip. Parts of a British Harrier jump jet litter the ground. A British pilot lost, and a great propaganda coup for the Argentines. The Argentine junta had gambled that an invasion of the disputed islands would rally the people to the flag, and it did. President Galtieri basks in national jubilation at the presidential palace in Buenos Aires. Argentine feelings about the islands took the world by surprise. Before the crisis, Britons knew little about the loyal British subjects who lived thousands of miles away in the South Atlantic. But every Argentine schoolchild knows about the Malvinas. And for years, Argentines have sworn that someday they would plant an Argentine flag here. But behind the images of war and nationalism, the cost. Both sides have sustained casualties, the Argentines more than the British. An Argentine captain is buried in Buenos Aires, but his young widow might well ask, for what? And thousands of miles away, several British wives and mothers might be asking the same question. The whole world watches now as Britain and Argentina tangle over sovereignty and determine the lives of 1,800 islanders. As diplomatic efforts continue to try and wind down the tension in the South Atlantic, we look at some of the political and economic realities in Argentina. Can Argentina afford this war? And more importantly, did the military junta need this external distraction? The majority of British people have rallied to the flag too, but the pros and cons of military action in the South Atlantic are debated almost daily in the Houses of Parliament. The statue of Winston Churchill reminds many people of sacrifices made by Britons to defend democratic rights. Churchill has been stirringly quoted by the British government in justifying their military response to the Argentine seizure of the islands. And though the opposition parties have questioned the use of force to dislodge the Argentines, very few MPs have wholeheartedly condemned the Conservative government's reaction to the crisis. When we spoke to the shadow foreign minister, Dennis Healy, Argentina and Britain had still not even agreed on a ceasefire. We asked him if it was worth spending both lives and money to protect the rights of so few people.
Well, I think what has been spent already is worthwhile, particularly if it contributes, as I believe it may, to a peaceful settlement. Because the issue is not just the 1,800 people living on the Falklands, it's whether you legitimize the use of force in the pursuit of territorial claims.
Force is not a word that the Argentine junta would shrink from. When General Leopoldo Galtieri took over as president in December, he inherited a host of pressing problems. And almost 6 years of tough military rule had not solved the problems left by the discredited Isabel Perón. Nevertheless, it was apparent that Galtieri himself had pressed President Viola to step down and make room for a new leader. Galtieri was characterized as the military strongman, a hardliner who would lead Argentines through a period of austerity and convince them it was for their own good. But his popularity rating wasn't very high. The invasion has changed this. But can an economy plagued by skyrocketing inflation and high unemployment sustain this military adventure? We asked Dr. George Phillip, lecturer in Latin American politics at the London School of Economics.
Well, in one sense, the answer is no. They have many, much more pressing things that they have to do, and the economic costs of fighting the war will be very high. On the other hand, politically, one might argue that they could not afford to stop before some form of military conclusion was reached, and successive Argentine governments, particularly military governments, have imposed almost any cost on the economy in pursuit of particular political objectives. And I think that the Argentine government at the moment will allow the economy to scream before they really allow their political objectives to be affected.
So far, the Argentine generals and Galtieri himself seem to have judged the mood of their people correctly. The takeover has become synonymous with Argentine nationalist pride and identity. And for the moment, it has clouded pressing internal issues. Before the crisis, the junta had been deeply unpopular with major sections of the Argentine people. In the years since they took over in 1976, the generals have gained an appalling record in human rights, and many people still want to see them called to account. But the most immediate threat now to the junta is the weakness of the Argentine economy. This is now so serious that no amount of nationalistic fervor can disguise it. For the Argentines, 1982 began in the traditional way. The nation's problems were briefly set aside. New Year had arrived. Argentina had expected 1982 to be a year like any other. After the celebrations, back to reality. Presently, Argentina, like many South American countries, is in the grip of a severe economic crisis. But in Argentina's case, the crisis is growing deeper every day, and all the signs point to difficult times ahead. Argentina's problems are not new. They have grown over the years. Inflation and devaluation are part of Argentina's economic life. Following years of relative prosperity, the economy, because of the world slump, began to stagnate, and then it too entered recession. Since 1979, Argentina's economic growth has been cut by 2/3. The devaluation of their currency, the peso, is not unusual. Last year, the peso was devalued by 28%. Recently, it was again devalued because of the country's continuing poor economic performance and the conflict over the Falklands. The economy has been dealt a further blow by the introduction of international economic sanctions. We asked Dr. Phillip how bad things were for Argentina.
I think it's still a little early for the full effects of the war to be known, but certainly the war and the sanctions will be serious cumulatively in their effects. Three different things are going to happen. First, the war has got to be paid for, and this means that consumption within Argentina is going to have to be squeezed to a significant degree, and probably some special imports to fight the war are going to be necessary, which would crowd out other kinds of imports. Second, Argentina's international financial position is going to worsen. Clearly, the international banks, who were, even at the beginning, not particularly happy about lending money to Argentina, are going to be extremely unwilling to do so at the moment. So that if Argentina wishes to continue within the international financial community, it is going to have to repay debt without being able to borrow any more. And this is going to mean that the domestic economy is going to have to be squeezed even more to release the resources to pay the rest of the world, to pay the international banks. And then thirdly, both of those changes have to be managed. They have to be accommodated within an economic policy. And that is perhaps going to be the most difficult thing of all.
So the prospects for the future are bleak. Inside Argentina, the economic situation is expected to get worse. Although the shops are still full of consumer goods, undoubtedly they will cost more as inflation picks up. Emergency economic measures were introduced recently to prop up the economy and finance military operations. The Finance Ministry claims the Falklands operations have cost Argentina some $170 million. Bankers believe the cost to be closer to $500 million. As a result, inflation is rising because the Junta has to print money to pay for the war. Inflation is being fueled by the Junta's inability to borrow money on the international market because of the sanctions. As part of the new economic package, import restrictions have been introduced. And as they take effect, goods in the shops will become scarce, pushing up prices and reducing living standards even further. Argentina's finances are so bad, the whole of the economy is on the brink of collapse. All levels of economic life are being affected by the financial crisis now underway. Argentina is on the brink of defaulting on the repayment of its outstanding debts to Western banks. It can do two things: either default and leave the international money market, or obtain further loans to roll over its debts. But to obtain further loans, Argentina would have to compromise on the issue of the Falklands. Such compromise would result in the sanctions being lifted and the threat of default removed. British banks could hope for their share of Argentine debt repayment and avoid a large loss of income. We asked Dennis Healy if he thought Britain could have fought Argentina with economic pressures alone.
No, I don't actually think so. You know, there's an awful lot of ruin in a nation's economy. And although the Argentine economy has been in a bad state for several years, I doubt whether economic pressure alone would have been enough to change the mind of the authorities there.
Britain, then, does not believe economic sanctions alone could secure Argentine withdrawal from the Falklands. And from the Argentine point of view, the sanctions have only served to strengthen its resolve to resist such pressures. Britain, and especially Prime Minister Mrs. Thatcher, have become Argentina's enemy number one. Britain and Argentina appear to be locked in a corridor without escape. Neither really wants an all-out fight, and neither wants to compromise. For Argentina, the conflict is not just about the Falklands. The economic repercussions may well prove to have far-reaching effects in the country itself. Already heavily into debt and unable to raise further loans, Argentina may well go into a deeper recession. Living standards will have to be squeezed even more. Already the government plans sweeping cuts to reduce spending. Major public works projects will be postponed, and a 6-month wage freeze will probably be introduced. Argentina's national problems demand the support of the Argentine people. But to solve these problems, the junta will need to curtail consumer satisfaction. Will the Argentine people put up with that for the sake of the crisis?
That really depends on how politically successful the government is in winning national backing for the war. You must remember that this set of austerity measures that will have to be imposed now are the third set to have been imposed in the recent past. Already in the late 70s there was a major austerity program which cut real wages back to something like the levels prevailing in the 1940s in Argentina. And then, just before the invasion of the Falklands, Alemán, the economics minister, was trying to put through another deflationary program, which would quite probably have caused real hardship to the Argentine working class, which, by Latin American standards, has always been quite a prosperous working class. And now there has got to be a third deflation or a third cut in living standards on top of the other two, and that might have really quite desperate effects. If the government is successful in whipping up a kind of war psychosis, then it may be possible that these economic measures could be put through, that people will appear willing to sustain quite severe economic hardship for some great patriotic scheme. But I rather think that kind of enthusiasm may be short-lived, and that within months, at any rate, there will be quite strong pressures within Argentina against that kind of policy.
The people in this square will probably be wary of the patriotic fervor created around the sovereignty issue. They are more concerned about the junta's internal policies. These women are the so-called mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. They want information about sons and daughters who have disappeared without trace. The estimates of missing people in Argentina vary, from 6,000 to as many as 30,000. People seized by the security forces who have been waging an internal war in Argentina. Every week, these people come to the Plaza de Mayo and ask the government for information about their relatives. Every week, they are refused. And now their plight has become a stumbling block in the negotiations for Argentina's return to democracy. Civilian politicians have slowly but surely been taking on a more prominent role in Argentine politics. In September last year, delegates from various parties met representatives of the junta to discuss the restoration of democratic government. Their main aim, they said, was for national reconciliation and a unified front to solve the country's political and economic problems. In July, the banned General Confederation of Labor tried to organize a national strike to protest about the state of the economy. Though some trains didn't run and a few factories closed, the strike was a failure. But 4 months later, in November, the CGT mobilized tens of thousands of people to protest against unemployment and the cost of living. The demonstration was held on St. Cayetano's Day to honor the patron saint of the workers. With the protest disguised as a religious festival, the government kept a relatively low profile. But as always, there was a military presence, and tensions gave way to clashes. Trade union leaders have been among the thousands of people arrested since the 1976 coup, and as Dr. Phillips says, they are growing restless.
The Argentine trade unions are quite powerful, certainly by far the most powerful anywhere in Latin America. They have taken a fairly quiet attitude for several years while their members' living standards have been squeezed, but they have become increasingly vocal and militant in the last few months. Before the Falklands invasion, there were a number of anti-government demonstrations in Buenos Aires, and if they are being asked to put up with further cuts in living standards on top of those already announced, they might turn very ugly indeed.
Three days before General Galtieri's forces went into the islands, this demonstration was staged in the Argentine capital. It was organized by the CGT and had the support of leading Peronist and socialist politicians. It was called because discussions about the return of democracy between the military and civilian leaders had reached an impasse. So the debate was taken to the streets. The government had produced draft bills providing for a return to party politics, but with one major stipulation. There would be no open discussion of the repression of the past few years, no investigation into the whereabouts of the so-called disappeared people. It was the biggest demonstration seen in Argentina for years. Many people were wounded. At least 2,000 were arrested. But just 3 days later, trade unionists, like the rest of the country, were focused on the seizure of the Malvinas. The movement backed the Junta, while at the same time insisting that its members would not carry the burden of the crisis, and that pressing internal economic and political problems should not be abandoned. The question now is, how long will trade unionists want to postpone their demands for what the Junta proclaims is the national interest? But even the capture of the islands doesn't distract dedicated Peronists. They live for the memory of Juan Perón and his first wife, Eva. The Perons helped shape the Argentine nationalism that has made the latest invasion so popular. And it's said that Juan Perón made the history of the islands into part of Argentina's heritage by nurturing a sense of grievance against the old world that Britain epitomized. The Peronists want more than the sovereignty of the Malvinas, though. As one woman expressed it to the dead Evita, the sovereignty she wanted was democratic rule for all Argentines.
Señora Evita, tuviste todo el poder. Tuviste el poder para hacer el bien. Tuviste el poder para acordarte de tus niños. Por eso, una vez más, señora, venimos hoy a juramentarte. La patria, señora, tendrá su soberanía o tendrá muchos cadáveres que no podrán venir a decirte el año que viene, siempre presente, señora.
Unidos o dominados. Te felicito.
¡Evita la patria peronista!
Whether Galtieri holds on to the islands, loses them militarily, or through diplomatic negotiations, the Peronists are bound to influence the political future of Argentina. Dr. Phillips gave us his view of what part Peronism might play in Argentina's future.
Well, Peronism is very strong in Argentina and has been for many years, but Peronism lacks a leader. Juan Perón is dead, his widow is in exile and largely discredited, and it is quite possible that a populist army officer could win Peronist support, and there could be a kind of political marriage between the nationalist wing of the army and the Peronists who are strong in the trade unions and in the working class. There are signs that before the invasion of the Falklands, Galtieri was actually aiming at some form of alliance of this kind, and it's quite likely that following a military defeat, that kind of alliance could come about again. A military officer could rise from perhaps a comparatively junior position, and in return for pursuing populist and nationalist policies could win support from the Peronists and the trade unions in a nationalist economic and political program. Should the military actually win, should Argentina succeed in keeping the Falklands, then it's quite possible that Galtieri will be able to win over the Peronists from a position of strength.
But according to Mr. Healy, a military defeat for Argentina could have serious consequences for the West.
My own feeling is that if we inflicted a heavy defeat on the Argentine, the present leadership would be replaced by another one. Now, it might be another military leadership, or it might be a Peronist government, half civilian, which would be more nationalistic than the Junta, and might, of course, appeal directly to the Soviet Union for support. This, I think, is one of the obvious political risks.
Soviet support for Argentina could take on several forms. The Soviet Union requires large amounts of grain to meet consumer needs and restock after 3 years of crop failures. Grain sales to the Soviet Union are an important source of income for the Argentine. In 1981, these sales accounted for a quarter of Argentina's visible export earnings. And this year, the Soviet Union was hoping to buy more than 80% of Argentina's total grain exports. Access to Argentine grain is important to the Soviet Union. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter cut off sales of U.S. grain as a political protest. But Argentina made no such objections and even increased its supplies to make up for the American shortfall. Another area of Soviet support for Argentina could be in the field of technology. In the longer term, Western trade sanctions against Argentina could backfire. Argentine nuclear know-how is for the moment supplied by West Germany. But should Argentina stop trading with the West, it could turn to the Soviet Union for what it needs. An increase in Soviet-Argentine trade links cannot be ruled out, should Argentina turn away from the West. Whatever happens, where will Argentina be when the crisis ends?
Well, the short answer is in a dreadful mess. If the crisis ends, as surely it must, with the removal of Argentine troops from the islands, with something that, however much it's disguised in Buenos Aires, would be, if not a defeat, then at least a fairly unsatisfactory outcome for Argentina, then I think Argentina is in for a period of political crisis. It is, without doubt, in for a period of economic crisis. Now, it's very likely that this economic crisis will lead to some reluctance or possibly an outright refusal to pay Argentina's foreign debt, at least on the terms specified. And that may have considerable influence both on international bankers' willingness to lend to Latin America as a whole, and also in the way in which other Latin American countries see the international system. And we may see a move towards protectionism and away from economic openness in a number of Latin American countries as a reaction to this.
The next few months, even the next few weeks, will decide the future shape of Western relations, not only with Argentina, but possibly the whole of Latin America. Whatever the final outcome, this crisis has already done some astonishing things. It's united the people behind the Junta. It's brought virtually the whole of Latin America out in support. It's shattered some Latin American preconceptions about the United States. It's a complicated picture, but still too early to say, just yet, who is going to get hurt most.